police arrest, black man at airport, then freeze, when they see his diplomatic passport. At a busy airport security checkpoint, a black man is pulled aside and interrogated by police officers who assume he's up to no good. With dismissive attitudes and baseless accusations, they treat him as if he's powerless. But little do they know, this man isn't just another traveler. He's a diplomat on an official mission. What happens next will leave the officers stunned and scrambling to recover from their mistake. This gripping story highlights themes of prejudice, accountability, and justice, as the tables turn in the most unexpected way. Before we dive into this powerful tale, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more impactful stories that challenge injustice and inspire change. Stay tuned for a twist that will leave you speechless. The airport was packed with travelers moving in every direction, the sound of rolling luggage blending with announcements echoing overhead. The security checkpoint was a hub of activity, officers scanning documents and directing people with sharp, authoritative gestures. A black man stood in line, his posture calm and composed. He wore a sharp suit and carried a leather briefcase, looking every bit like the professional he was. His eyes scanned the line ahead, his expression neutral. He was on his way to an important international meeting, representing his country as a diplomat. Years of facing prejudice had prepared him for moments like this, and his demeanor reflected quiet confidence. Two officers at the checkpoint watched him closely, exchanging a brief glance before stepping forward. Their stares lingered a little too long, their body language making it clear they had singled him out. "Step aside," one of them said curtly, their tone leaving no room for discussion. The man looked at them calmly. "Is there a problem?" he asked politely, his voice steady. "Routine check," the officer replied, but his dismissive tone suggested otherwise. The man nodded and moved as directed. He had seen this before. Situations where assumptions were made before facts were known. He knew how to handle it. With patience and calm, the officers began their questioning immediately. "What's your reason for travel?" one asked, flipping through his passport. "Business," the man replied simply. "What kind of business?" the other officer pressed, his tone sharp. "I'm attending a conference," the man said, meeting their gaze without hesitation. Their skepticism was evident. They asked more questions about his destination, the purpose of his trip, and how long he planned to stay. The man answered each one with precision, his voice never wavering. "You seem awfully confident," one officer said, his tone carrying an edge. "Should I not be?" the man asked, his calm response catching them off guard. Their irritation grew as they continued the interrogation. They searched his briefcase, flipping through neatly organized documents and scanning his laptop. The contents were exactly what one would expect from a professional: work files, a schedule, and notes for his meeting. Still, the officers weren't satisfied. "Why are you carrying these documents?" one asked, holding up a folder marked with official insignia. "They're related to my work," the man replied evenly. The other officer leaned closer, his voice dropping to a patronizing tone. "What kind of work requires this much paperwork?" "I've already explained the purpose of my trip," the man replied, his patience steady. Their frustration became more apparent. They glanced at each other, their expressions hardening. "Step over here," one said, motioning toward a more isolated area near the checkpoint. The man complied without resistance, his movements calm and deliberate. He understood what was happening. They were looking for a reason to escalate, to justify their assumptions. "You're being difficult," one officer said as they continued their questioning. "Difficult?" the man asked, raising an eyebrow. "I've answered every question you've asked." "That attitude won't help you here," the officer replied, his tone sharp. "I don't have an attitude," the man said firmly. I'm simply answering your questions. The officer's jaw tightened. You think you're untouchable, don't you? The man's gaze didn't falter. I think everyone deserves to be treated with respect, he said. Their irritation reached a boiling point. We'll see about that, one officer muttered before signaling for backup. The whispers of onlookers grew louder as the officers escorted the man away. The crowd watched, some recording on their phones, while others exchanged worried glances. But the man remained composed, his confidence unshaken by the growing tension. He knew the truth about who he was. And soon, the officers would learn it too. The officers stood with crossed arms, watching the man closely as if searching for something suspicious in his every move. One officer stepped forward, his tone sharp. "You've been flagged for suspicious behavior," he said. The man tilted his head slightly. "Suspicious? What behavior are you referring to?" he asked calmly. "We don't owe you an explanation," the officer snapped. "You need to cooperate, or this will get worse for you." The man nodded slowly. "I've been cooperating since the moment you approached me. If there's something specific you'd like me to address, I'm happy to clarify." His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate them further. The second officer, standing slightly behind, chimed in with a condescending tone. "Where were you before you got to the airport? Who did you meet with?" The man met his gaze without flinching. "I came straight from my residence. I haven't met with anyone." The first officer stepped closer, his voice lowering to a near growl. "We're going to ask you again. Why are you here, and why does your behavior stand out?" The man maintained his composure. "I'm here on business, as I've explained. My behavior is no different from anyone else's, and I'm curious to know what you think makes me stand out." "You're being evasive," the officer snapped. "If you've got nothing to hide, then why are you acting so defensive?" "I'm not being defensive," the man replied firmly. "I'm being direct. There's nothing unusual about my travel, and I've complied with your instructions." The second officer scoffed. "You people always think you can talk your way out of trouble," he muttered under his breath. The man's expression remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean by 'you people'?" he asked, his tone measured. The officer froze for a split second before brushing off the question. "Don't twist my words," he said. "We're not here to debate semantics. We're here to ensure airport security is upheld." "And I fully support that," the man said. "But I haven't done anything to compromise security." The first officer waved a hand dismissively. "Let's not waste any more time," he said. "Hand over your phone." The man raised an eyebrow. "Why do you need my phone?" "We have reason to believe you've been communicating about something suspicious," the officer said. "I've been using my phone for work-related matters," the man replied. "There's nothing suspicious about that." "You don't get to decide what's suspicious," the second officer barked. "Hand it over." The man hesitated for a moment, then calmly handed them his phone. "Here you go," he said. They snatched the device, scrolling through it with exaggerated scrutiny. After several moments, one officer frowned. "What's this?" he demanded, holding up an email with official insignia. "It's correspondence for my work," the man said simply. "Who do you work for?" the first officer asked, his tone sharp. "I've already answered that," the man replied. "Answer it again," the officer snapped. "I'm attending an international conference as part of my work," the man said patiently. "I'm a representative of my country." The second officer rolled his eyes. "Representative? Is that supposed to impress us?" The man didn't respond to the sarcasm, instead standing quietly as they continued their interrogation. The tension grew as the officers began raising their voices, accusing him of withholding information and behaving suspiciously. The man remained calm, his composure unwavering despite their hostility. "You're acting like you're above the rules," the first officer said, stepping closer. "I'm not above the rules," the man replied. "I'm simply asking for clarity on why I'm being treated this way." "Stop playing games," the second officer snapped. "We know your type. You think you're too smart to get caught, but we're not falling for it." "My type?" the man repeated, his voice calm but firm. "And what type is that, exactly?" The first officer gestured aggressively toward the man's briefcase. "You're carrying documents we don't understand, sending emails with official-looking logos and refusing to give us straight answers. That's enough for us to take you into custody." The man's expression didn't change. "You're free to verify everything I've told you," he said. "I have nothing to hide." The officers ignored his words, their irritation boiling over. "Turn around," the first officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Am I being arrested?" the man asked, his tone still calm. "You're being detained," the officer replied curtly. "For what reason?" "For resisting," the second officer snapped. The man raised an eyebrow. "I haven't resisted anything. You've resisted by not answering our questions directly," the first officer said. "Now, turn around." The man complied without argument, allowing them to cuff him. Travelers in the terminal began murmuring louder, their discomfort evident as the scene unfolded. "Is that really necessary?" someone asked quietly. "He hasn't done anything," another voice added. The officers ignored the comments as they led the man away, their grip on his arms unnecessarily tight. Despite the circumstances, the man walked with his head held high, his calm demeanor unshaken. As they entered a holding area, the first officer gestured toward a chair. "Sit!" he barked. The man complied, settling into the chair without a word. The officers stood over him, their postures tense and aggressive. "Let's get one thing straight," the first officer said. "You're in serious trouble. The sooner you cooperate, the better it'll be for you." The man looked up at him, his gaze steady. "I've been cooperating since the beginning," he said. "Don't get smart with us," the second officer snapped. "You're not in a position to argue." The man didn't respond, his silence unnerving them. "Do you think this is a game?" the first officer demanded, slamming his hand on the table. "No," the man replied calmly. "But I think you're about to realize you've made a mistake." The officers exchanged a confused glance, their arrogance beginning to falter. They didn't yet understand the gravity of their actions, but they would soon. The man sat quietly in the cold, stark holding room, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The two officers loomed over him, their frustration evident in their tense postures and sharp glares. One of them, pacing back and forth, stopped abruptly to lean across the table. "You think staying quiet makes you look innocent," the officer demanded. "It doesn't. It just makes you look guilty." The man's expression remained composed, his voice steady. "I've already answered your questions. If you have more, I'll gladly clarify, but I suggest you take a moment to think about your actions before proceeding further." The officer scoffed, shaking his head. "There it is again, that tone. You act like you're the one in charge here. Let me remind you, you're not." "I'm not acting," the man replied calmly. "I'm simply stating the facts." The second officer slammed a folder onto the table, clearly losing his patience. "You don't get to talk about facts. We know what's going on here, and we're not letting you walk out without answers." The man tilted his head slightly, his voice unwavering. "What exactly do you think is going on?" "You're hiding something," the first officer snapped. "Your documents, your attitude. It all points to someone trying to pull a fast one." The man's calm demeanor seemed to unnerve them further. "You're basing your assumptions on a narrative you've created," he said. "But assumptions don't make something true." The pacing officer stopped. His fists clenched. "You think you're smarter than us?" "No," the man replied simply. "But I do think I'm more patient." The second officer leaned closer, his voice low and threatening. "Your patience won't mean anything when you're facing charges." The man met his gaze unflinching. "Charges for what?" "Following your instructions, answering your questions, carrying official documents for my work." "Enough!" the first officer barked. "You don't get to question us." "I'm not questioning you," the man said evenly. "I'm pointing out the flaws in your logic." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick as the officers exchanged uncertain glances. It was clear they were unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by someone who remained so composed. The pacing officer finally broke the silence, his tone laced with arrogance. "Let's cut the act. Who are you really working for? And don't give us the conference excuse again." The man's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I've been transparent about who I am and why I'm here. It's not my fault if you've chosen not to listen." The second officer slammed his palm on the table, his voice rising. "You think this is a joke? Do you know how much trouble you're in?" "Do you?" the man asked calmly, his tone carrying an edge of authority that made the officer hesitate. "What's that supposed to mean?" the pacing officer snapped. "It means," the man said, leaning forward slightly, "that you're operating under assumptions that will cost you dearly if you don't reconsider your actions." The officers exchanged another glance, their confidence faltering slightly, but their arrogance wouldn't allow them to back down. "Enough with the riddles," the first officer growled. "If you've got something to say, say it now." The man took a deep breath, his voice measured. "Very well," he said. "I tried to handle this with patience and professionalism, but since you insist—" He shifted in his seat, angling his body to reach into his jacket pocket despite the cuffs. The officers immediately stepped forward, their hands hovering over their holsters. "What are you doing?" one of them barked. "I'm retrieving proof of who I am," the man replied calmly. "You can relax." The officers hesitated before nodding. "Slowly," one said, his voice tight. The man carefully withdrew a sleek black wallet from his pocket and placed it on the table. With a flick of his wrist, he opened it to reveal a diplomatic passport, its gold lettering glinting under the fluorescent light. The room went completely still. The first officer leaned forward, his eyes scanning the document with growing disbelief. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The second officer, standing frozen behind him, managed to stammer, "Diplomatic." "That's correct," the man said evenly. "I'm a diplomat representing my country at an international conference. And this," he tapped the passport gently, "means I have immunity." The silence was deafening as the weight of his words sank in. The officers' faces turned pale, their confidence crumbling as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. I didn't," the first officer began, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't know?" the man finished for him. "That's because you didn't ask. Instead, you assumed. You escalated. And now, you've created a situation that could have been avoided entirely." The second officer took a step back, his hands trembling slightly. "We didn't mean to—" "But you did," the man interrupted, his tone sharper now. "You meant to assert your power without justification. You meant to treat me as less than human because of your own biases. And now, you'll face the consequences." The pacing officer finally sank into the chair across from him, his head in his hands. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "Oh, it's happening," the man said firmly. and I suggest you prepare yourselves for what comes next." As the officers sat in stunned silence, the door to the holding room creaked open. A senior officer stepped in, his expression one of confusion quickly shifting to concern as he took in the scene. His eyes landed on the diplomatic passport on the table, and his jaw tightened. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his tone authoritative. The man turned to him calmly. "I'd like to report an incident of misconduct," he said. The senior officer's gaze shifted to his subordinates, who looked like they wanted to disappear. "Explain," he barked, glaring at them. The first officer opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The second officer looked down at the floor, his face flushed with embarrassment. The man didn't wait for them to respond. "I'll be filing a formal complaint through the proper channels," he said, his tone steady. "This behavior is unacceptable and must be addressed." The senior officer nodded solemnly, his expression grim. "You have my full cooperation," he said. The man stood, his composure intact despite the ordeal. "I'll be expecting follow-up," he said as he straightened his suit. "For now, I'll continue with my travel plans." The officers didn't dare meet his gaze as he walked past them, his diplomatic passport in hand. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and they were left to grapple with the weight of their actions. The senior officer's gaze shifted between the diplomatic passport on the table and the two officers, who stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. He turned back to the man, his tone now careful and respectful. "Sir, may I ask for clarification about your role?" The man straightened his posture, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I am Ambassador Charles, a high-ranking official representing my country at an international conference. I am here under diplomatic immunity as part of a mission to strengthen international relations and address global policy issues." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the officers absorbed the weight of his words. Their earlier arrogance had completely crumbled, replaced by panic and regret. "An ambassador?" the senior officer asked, his voice betraying his own surprise. "Yes," the man replied evenly, "and I carry full diplomatic immunity, as stated in the Vienna Convention. What these officers have done violates international protocols and undermines the very principles they are sworn to uphold." The two officers exchanged panicked glances, their mouths opening and closing as they struggled to form a response. We didn't know," one of them stammered. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to find out," the ambassador said firmly. "Instead, you chose to act on assumptions. And now, you've created an international incident that will have consequences far beyond this room." The senior officer's jaw tightened, and he turned to the two officers. "Is this true? Did you fail to verify his credentials before escalating the situation?" Neither officer answered, their silence speaking volumes. The ambassador's gaze didn't waver as he continued. "This isn't just about me. This is about the systemic behavior that allows individuals like these officers to abuse their authority unchecked. Their actions today are not only unprofessional, but also a stain on the integrity of this institution." The tension in the room was thick, and the murmur of voices from outside grew louder. News of the incident had spread quickly, and a small group of airport staff and travelers had gathered near the holding area, their curiosity evident. A security staff member stepped forward hesitantly, his voice low. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing the ambassador. "Is it true that you're an ambassador?" "It is," the man confirmed. The staff member nodded, his expression one of both awe and regret. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said. "This shouldn't have happened at all." The ambassador gave him a small, polite nod. "Thank you. Your acknowledgement is appreciated." The two officers shuffled uncomfortably, their earlier confidence replaced by visible embarrassment. One of them finally found his voice, though it was weak and unconvincing. "We thought you were hiding something," he said, his words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to justify his actions. "Hiding something?" the ambassador repeated, his tone sharp. "What exactly did you think I was hiding? My credentials? My work? Or was it simply easier to assume I didn't belong here because of how I look?" The officer looked down at the floor, his face flushed with shame. The senior officer stepped forward, addressing the ambassador directly. "Sir, I deeply apologize for this incident. This is unacceptable, and I assure you that it will be handled appropriately." "I expect nothing less," the ambassador said. "But an apology is only the first step. There needs to be accountability, not just for these individuals, but for the system that allowed this to happen." The group of onlookers outside the room continued to grow, their whispers filling the air as they tried to piece together what had happened. A traveler near the front of the crowd turned to the person beside them. "Did you hear that? He's an ambassador. Those cops just messed up big time." Another nodded, their expression a mix of disbelief and admiration. "He handled it so calmly. I don't know if I could have done the same in his position." Inside the room, the second officer finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said, his words directed at the ambassador. "We made a mistake." "A mistake?" the ambassador repeated, his voice steady but firm. "A mistake is forgetting to check a box on a form. What you did was far more than a mistake. It was a deliberate abuse of power fueled by prejudice." The officer's head hung lower, his regret evident. The senior officer stepped forward again, his tone more formal. "Ambassador Charles, I will ensure that this incident is documented and addressed at the highest levels. These officers will face disciplinary action, and we will review our protocols to prevent something like this from happening again." "I appreciate your willingness to take responsibility," the ambassador said, "but this cannot be resolved with disciplinary action alone. There must be systemic changes to ensure that no one else has to endure what I've experienced today." He turned to the officers, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to understand the gravity of your actions. You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected the position I hold and the country I represent. And that has consequences." The first officer opened his mouth as if to respond, but quickly closed it again, realizing there was nothing he could say to defend himself. The senior officer addressed the crowd outside, his voice firm. "This area is now off limits. Please return to your business." The crowd slowly began to disperse, though the whispers continued as people walked away. As the ambassador prepared to leave, he turned back to the senior officer. "I will be in contact with your superiors to follow up on this matter. In the meantime, I trust you will handle it appropriately." "You have my word, sir," the senior officer said, his tone sincere. The ambassador nodded once before walking out of the room, his posture straight and his head held high. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and the officers were left to face the consequences of their actions. As the ambassador exited the terminal, the weight of the moment hung in the air. He had endured yet another instance of prejudice, but he had also used the opportunity to hold those in power accountable. For the airport staff and travelers who had witnessed the incident, it was a stark reminder of the dangers of assumptions and the importance of treating everyone with respect. For the officers, it was a humbling experience that would likely change the way they approached their work, if they were allowed to continue working at all. And for the ambassador, it was another step in his lifelong mission to challenge prejudice and create a more just world. The fallout from the incident was swift and unavoidable. By the time Ambassador Charles left the airport, news of the event had already begun circulating. Witnesses who had recorded parts of the altercation posted videos online, and the story quickly gained traction, drawing widespread attention. The police department issued an official statement the next morning, acknowledging the situation and promising a full investigation. The 2 officers involved were immediately suspended, pending disciplinary review. The department faced mounting pressure from the public and international organizations to address the incident and ensure accountability. For Ambassador Charles, the experience was deeply personal, but also representative of a broader issue. When asked by reporters for a comment, he responded with professionalism and grace. "This incident is not about me alone," he said during a press conference. "It is a symptom of a larger problem: assumptions, stereotypes, and the abuse of power that harm not just individuals, but the integrity of the systems meant to serve and protect." His words resonated far beyond the immediate audience. Advocates for justice and equality hailed his composure and strength, using the incident as a rallying point for discussions about systemic bias and the importance of accountability. The officers' careers were effectively over. One of them released a public apology, acknowledging his mistakes and the harm caused by his actions. "I let my assumptions guide my behavior, and for that I am deeply sorry," he wrote. "I will use this experience to reflect and grow." But for many, apologies weren't enough. Apologies must be followed by action, Ambassador Charles emphasized in an interview. If we are to build a more just and equitable society, we must hold people accountable and address the root causes of these issues. The diplomatic community rallied behind him, with several ambassadors and international officials expressing their support. Ambassador Charles handled the situation with dignity and integrity, one colleague said. He turned a moment of personal injustice into an opportunity to call for systemic change. The incident also sparked discussions among airport staff and law enforcement agencies. Many called for increased training on bias awareness and de-escalation techniques, recognizing that such changes were necessary to rebuild trust. Public reactions poured in from around the world. Some shared their own experiences with prejudice, expressing solidarity with Ambassador Charles. Others praised his handling of the situation, calling him a role model for turning a moment of injustice into a platform for advocacy. This story isn't just about an ambassador being mistreated, one social media post read. It's about how we view and treat people based on assumptions. It's a wake-up call for all of us. Ambassador Charles remained focused on the bigger picture. While he could have pursued legal action or demanded personal retribution, he chose instead to advocate for systemic change. "My goal is not to punish individuals," he said. "It is to ensure that these patterns of behavior are dismantled so they cannot harm others in the future." He worked closely with international organizations and human rights advocates to use the incident as a case study for reform. His calm yet firm response became a model for addressing prejudice and abuse of power without resorting to anger or retaliation. In the weeks that followed, the airport implemented new protocols, including mandatory training for all officers on cultural sensitivity, bias awareness, and proper handling of diplomatic personnel. The changes were welcomed by many, who saw them as a step in the right direction. At a global forum on equality and justice, Ambassador Charles gave a keynote speech, sharing his story and the lessons it carried. "Authority is a responsibility, not a privilege," he said. "It must be exercised with respect, humility, and an unwavering commitment to justice. When we fail to uphold these principles, we fail the very people we are meant to serve." His words were met with a standing ovation, the audience moved by his message of resilience and accountability. The incident became a turning point, sparking meaningful change not just within the airport, but in broader conversations about how institutions handle bias and power dynamics. It served as a reminder that one person's courage and composure could have ripple effects far beyond the immediate moment. For Ambassador Charles, it was a reminder of why he had pursued his career in the first place. Despite the challenges he had faced, he remained committed to the ideals of justice and equality. He knew there was still much work to be done, but he also knew that progress was possible. One step, one conversation, and one moment of accountability at a time. As the story faded from the headlines, its impact endured. It wasn't just a story about a man wronged at an airport. It was a story about standing firm in the face of injustice, about using one's voice to demand better, and about the power of grace and integrity to inspire change. This story reminds us of a powerful truth. Stereotypes blind us, but respect and accountability open the door to understanding. Assumptions and prejudice not only harm individuals, but also weaken the very systems meant to uphold fairness and justice. Ambassador Charles's composure and integrity in the face of injustice demonstrate that change begins when we choose to rise above and challenge systemic biases with grace and determination. Now, let's reflect. Have you ever been judged unfairly? How did that experience shape your perspective? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your experiences can inspire others to think differently and act with more empathy. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful tales that challenge injustice and inspire meaningful change. Together, we can amplify the message that respect, humility, and accountability are essential for building a better, fairer world. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story, where we uncover more truths that challenge, inspire, and unite us all. Let's continue to learn, reflect, and take action toward a world where every individual is treated with dignity and respect.